As I think we all know, being Division 2 fans, one of the biggest aspects of the Division 2 is building, building your gear sets, building your brand sets, building out, your kit and choosing the weapons that you want to use because there's just so much to do in the game. And that's basically the crux of why the Division is enjoyable, because you're constantly trying out different stuff. Well, a few years ago, I actually started talking about what the Division really needs and how it needs to maintain the levels of interest. And it looks like it might be possible that the Division 2 is actually about to do one of these things that I've talked about in the past. Now, over the few years that I've been covering the Division now, I've come up with many different things that I think really needs to happen with the Division, or at least things that they need to improve. I don't go into like specifics exactly, like you have to add this thing, you have to add this thing, but I've kind of taken the approach that there's certain things that are lacking in the game and they need to be improved. For example, if you look at Division 1 when it launched, there was a lot of detail there. There was a lot of micro choices and main choices that you could make to, improve your builds or change up your builds or, spec into one specific area very tightly, making it a very unique, specific build. And that was good because, the Division portrayed itself as an RPG. Of course, as the Division went on, they kind of tried to, change some of these stats. They, tightened it up a little bit. They removed some stuff. Most of it was still there, but it wasn't quite as in-depth as it was at launch. Now, of course, fast forward to Division 2, they drastically changed how the stats and all that stuff worked. Basically, that system was like each stat was based on a pool of available points, and so you couldn't really get max gear. You could get a max stat, but all the other stats would suffer because they were all tied to like a single pool of how high the stats can get. And a lot of players had a problem with it. My biggest problem was just that the system itself was a little bit basic and a little bit boring, and there was easy ways to cheese it because certain stats and certain things and certain roles and slots were far superior than other ones. And this was very obvious to me. Honestly, it didn't feel like it was very obvious to the developers. But it was the biggest reason why, like, Araldi and Gilligard were pretty much the top gear choices for almost everyone playing anything. Right? If you knew the game, if you knew how to build, and you saw these same, issues, yeah, this, like all the builds back then, it was like how many Gilligard and how many Araldi are on the builds, because those were the peak gear pieces. Of course, this led into Gear 2.0 happening, and in my opinion, Gear 2.0 is a complete and utter disgrace because it destroyed a lot of the RPG of the game, right? It removed the talent slots from the gear. It removed the 3, talent slots from the weapons. If you remember, you had like the 2 talent slots for the weapon, and then you had like the holstered talent and stuff like that. Again, you had, the 6 talent slots for each, like your armor pieces. So you had 6 talents in those pieces instead of just chest and backpack. And this, allowed them to have the 6-piece, gear sets, right? Originally they had 6-piece gear sets, but of course with Gear 2.0 they changed it to 2-piece or 4-piece gear sets with the chest and the backpack talents on them. So they also, in doing this, they also, removed a bunch of the stats in the game. There was originally crit resistance, and there was explosive resistance mods, and there was, like armor percentage rolls and stuff like that. And they removed a lot of it, and they tailored it down to what they wanted and how they wanted it to play. And they made health completely useless, and they made it, getting hazard protection on your build really, really difficult and annoying. Many changes that I think Gear 2.0 just kind of crapped on. And overall, the pattern that we see is that the amount of options, the amount of diversity, the amount of, actual specifics that you can get into have decreased year over year with the game, basically. Like going from Division 1 at launch, going, like Division 1 at the end to Division 2 to Gear 2.0, and hopefully this trend isn't continuing. But it does look like, they are set to add something that could hopefully help this out a little bit. And of course, what I'm referring to here is an interview with Yannick from godisageek.com. Of course, this was brought to my attention from Sergeant Greybeard. But what was indicated was that there is going to be a new item type. Now, we don't necessarily know what this item type is. But my assumption, based on the little bit of information that we're seeing, what they're talking about with doing, things in the game, and how he phrases it by, kind of like reshuffling the gear and creating new items. To me, this is going back into kind of like something similar to what Destiny did when they had like the artifacts, or I forget exactly what they added, but there was a new piece of gear that you could get that had stats on it. And if you actually kind of pay attention through some of the stuff in the end of the Manhunt, so spoiler alert if you haven't done the Manhunt, maybe you want to like tune out for a minute. But during this Manhunt, obviously the Black Tusk apparently shuts down the Shade server or something, so they stop the Shade server from working. What happens then is, they say that, oh, well, you can still use your Shade abilities because we have a mobile Shade terminal somehow, right? So this implies that if you weren't near Kelso during that mission, you couldn't use skills at that time because they would have been shut down. So Kelso is allowing you to use skills because she has a mobile Shade server or terminal or something with her. At the end of this, what is basically said is that, we need to go to New York, potentially get our own mobile Shade system or something like that. Now, a few years ago, I actually talked about, I made just some random infographic that I don't have anymore. But basically, I was talking about, they need to, if they're going to continue like decreasing the amount of stats on gear, maybe they should just add more pieces of gear. I think one of the pieces that I talked about was, well, why don't they, actually give you a gear piece for your Isaac, right? If you use like the scanner pulse or whatever, or the Banshee pulse, you can kind of see like the cosmetics on that item change. So it does imply that if you have a scanner based skill, the scanner is there on your shoulder. But besides that specific use, you have this piece of equipment that, doesn't necessarily do too much other than kind of like communicate with you and in the background, at least as far as the lore of the game goes, control some of your, division type skills and stuff like that. So we do know from, the original Warlords of New York storyline that, the rogues were tinkering with the watches and tinkering with Isaac and stuff like that and making their own version apparently. And I forget the one rogue agent, was it Parnell? It was the nerdy guy. he was like the kind of like the tech guru of that rogue group, and he was talking about hacking that stuff, right? So like they knew how to hack that stuff. That's what Aaron Keener was doing. He was hacking this stuff, and almost like it seems like a foreshadowing of Keener knew that stuff was going on and he was trying to figure out a way to fight it. It's kind of been left in the air a bit whether he was actually good or bad, because there was, if you guys kind of remember, there was a audio recording about him saving a group of people escaping from New York City. So his disillusionment has always been based on the government failing, right? It's never been, I want to destroy the world. At least, for my understanding of it. And it's kind of been mispainted almost that Keener was a bad guy, but his actions were, a bit extreme and crazy. But it was kind of, I think it's more nuanced than that, right? So we have him trying to do these steps to potentially, it looked like, fight the Black Tusk and fight the powers that were creating, a bunch of problems, right? So it looks like he was moving in the direction of stopping this. And it's kind of been the assumption that, maybe we are rogue, or maybe we're going to go rogue, or, it's been hinted at through a lot of the story stuff where division agents are bad or good, or, there's this whole, nuanced shade of gray with what we are. Anyway, so you look at it, And you've got Kelso talking about this mobile shade server, getting to Paul Rhodes. Paul Rhodes has already, cracked the watch and done stuff with Isaac. He's done a bunch of work for us, in terms of skills and stuff. And he has a lot of that, the knowledge, or at least some of the, the programming and stuff like that from Parnell that they were using to, keep their own skills and stuff like that active. So us going to him kind of indicates to me that we are going to be getting some sort of device, probably from him, that is going to basically be an equipment slot. So instead of having the 6 armor rolls that we do now, we're going to have possibly 7. And I don't see a reason why it has to be limited to 7. Maybe, if they continue the game, they could eventually go to 8, 9, 10. You look at something like Diablo where they've got, all the armor rolls or all the armor pieces, and then you've got like the rings and the trinkets and stuff like that. That's really great because the more things you add, the more unique and fun you can kind of have with builds. When you're stuck with 6 items, it's very limiting and very boring. So hopefully this new item does something great. Now, I guess the biggest question, if we go off the basis that this is going to be a new item that is going to slot in just like every other piece of gear, right? So like it's going to be its own unique thing, separate from weapons, it's separate from armor. And it's going to be something that gives you abilities or stats or whatever. What kind of stuff is it going to allow? Now, is it going to, are there going to be, only a few different types? Is this going to be like a random roll stuff? Is it going to be randomly rollable, for example? Like, is it going to be based off of the stat system that we currently have? Meaning, you could find, you could defeat enemies and find a random upgrade in the world. So, for example, it could drop with like increased weapon damage or increased crit chance or increased skill tier. Could it do one of those things? Could it give you hazard protection, or could it give you health, or any of these other roles that exist in the game? Is it just going to be like that? It's going to be armor and stats, right? Or is it going to be skill tier and stats, or weapon damage and stats? Is it going to follow that category? Or is it possible that this is going to be a completely separate thing? Like, for example, there's going to be, like a tank-specific one, or a DPS-specific one, or a skill-specific one. Could it be that this item ends up giving you, like special bonuses for skills? So maybe like there's a specific one that you can equip for like fire turrets or incinerator turrets, where when you have this specific item equipped, it allows your incendiary turret to, actually, shoot in a full circle. Could you have one that gives you, like other abilities or additional like skill slot? Like who knows what these things could be, but it could be an interesting way to make the game interesting again. Because look, there's a lot of attempts with new gear to like kind of like reinvigorate the game, but at the same time, I think we all realize by this point that it doesn't matter what the gear is, it still feels pretty much the same. Yeah, like Negotiator allows for a slightly different play style because you mark enemies and then shoot one and then the crits, damage them. Okay, yeah, and you've got, ongoing directive for bleed, but I mean, but let's be honest, you have, your main play styles, which is DPS or skill damage, and then you might include like tanks in that, but obviously again at the end of the day tanks have to deal damage, so like being just a full pure tank build and playing solo isn't very fun. And again, you can't really get through the game as like you can get through the game, but it's not very much fun to play as like a full skill healer build by yourself, because again it takes forever to kill enemies. So how do they, go about adding something to the game that's not just a set that people are going to play the exact same way as everything else, because that's how the game's designed? How do you get past this and actually add some real diversity to the game? Add something that really switches it up. And I hope that this new item is exactly what that's going to, provide. I hope this new item kind of allows things to shine a little bit more specifically and more uniquely than what we see currently. And that's really the only thing I could even say. Like, if this item is unique and good and provides a lot of detail to the game, then I think we can see, year 5 is going to be great. Because, look, when you add stuff to the game that's not just the standard, choices that you already have, that's great, right? Because that provides more depth than anything else. It's got, like, kind of like, think of it like this, right? When you're making a build, like, let's say you're making a DPS build, and you've got all red rolls on it. So you've got, like, max weapon damage on this build. Well, we already know that if you really sacrifice something for, like, let's say you add, like, 3 or 2 pieces of Walker and Harris, or is it just 1 piece? I forget. 1 piece of Walker and Harris for the 5% weapon damage. Or you go, like, 1 piece of Fenris for 10% AR damage, right? That 5% or that 10% really isn't dealing a huge amount of damage as like on that build. That 5% or that 10% extra damage, because you've already got so much base weapon damage now, that additional tiny bit extra isn't adding much to the build. And so, I mean, if you kind of think about it in a similar way as, like, well, brand sets, gear sets, weapons, they're not really adding anything new or unique to the game. They still have to accomplish the base task. And if the base task is always, well, I got to kill the enemies before they kill me, then of course it prioritizes what people are going to run. And because of that, just adding a new set of abilities based on, the standard model. I mean, like, look, compare Striker to Heartbreaker. I mean, they're kind of the same thing. Like, okay, yeah, one's got, like, some bonus armor, but they're really the same. Then you add in other brands or other gear sets or other exotics, and you're accomplishing kind of the same thing. In this regard, this new item has the ability to offer something that is not the same thing. It has the ability to change all of the current builds in the game in a much more dramatic fashion than, like, let's say, a single exotic could, or a single, named item could. It can provide so much more diversity, because, look, literally, if you add in 1 exotic, you don't really change that many builds. Like, even the Ninja Bike, which is supposed to be this kind of, like, diversity king, at the end of the day, it offered a few better builds for specific things, but by and large, most of those were not better than something you could build with, like, the Memento backpack, or just, a high-end backpack with a really good talent. Like, at the end of the day, it only offered a few newer, unique builds than you could get before. And that's the same for every exotic. They fit into their little niche, and outside of that little niche, they're not very good. So an exotic by itself, maybe, there might be, like, a few variations, a handful of new builds that you can actually get away with that are good. And the same thing with new weapons. Like, you add a new weapon, and you're going to be basically pasting it into a build that you already have. And it's not really going to change that much, because it's just a slight variation. But when you add a whole new item type, every build in the game can now be different. So, I mean, we really need to see how these item types actually, come out, like what they actually offer. If it's really, what I'm thinking of, or who knows, maybe they called it a new item type, but really it's kind of like, let's say, like, consumable, right? Maybe the new item type that they're adding is consumables. Let's be honest, it would kind of deflate everything that I've just said in this entire video, because everything that I said is based around it actually being like an item that is usable and is equipable and good, right? A consumable item, if that's what they secretly mean, I mean, it's going to have some effect, but it's not going to be a build thing, right? It's just going to be a use thing, just like kind of like grenades. Grenades really don't have too much effect on a build, and but you can have them. So anyway, my point is, like, we really have to be careful with what this item is. Hopefully they're actually giving it some serious thought, and it's going to actually improve the game itself by adding, more diversity, more combinations, some interesting mechanics that you just don't necessarily have with current gear, and yeah, I really think that if they played it right, that a new item based on the surrounding circumstances that I already said, with the whole shade server thing, having a mobile shade terminal, going into kind of like, again, it fits in the story with Paul Rhodes and Kelso and going to New York and doing all this stuff. I really think it could fit well. I really think it could be a really great improvement to the game and add more diversity and more stats. Which, again, this is an RPG. As much fun as the shooting portion is, it is a shooter, sure, but it is based on an RPG and all the elements that players love and talk about all the time, which is building, right? Like half of YouTube videos on the Division are build videos, right? Why are they build videos? Because that's the most enjoyable part of the game. And without that, without the RPG elements of the build portion and all this stuff, it's not as fun as it is. It's not as, interesting to the player base. It doesn't continue on, like the lifespan of the game is very short without build mechanics. Look, if there was nothing to build in the game, I would not still be playing it. If this was just a generic shooter and I did the missions already, I wouldn't still be a part of the community. Like if this wasn't, like Division 1 captured the audience that loved the game because of all the options and all the creativity that you can do. And Division 2, despite all of its problems, the same thing. All these, builds that you can make, all the diversity that you can, just choose from. That's why people love the Division, right? That's why people love, things like Diablo or World of Warcraft, stuff like that, just because, you can choose and you can pick and you can play what you want and how you want and you can have fun. And the more options that you give, the more controlled and I guess, thought out these options are, the better. If, we don't need a game with like, 1,000 different variables, like you've got like 1,000 you've got 6 pieces of gear and each piece of gear has like 50 rolls on it. Like, oh man, no, that's not great. Okay, but I mean, if you're looking at the current game and you've got 6 armor items and each armor item has 3 rolls on it, like that's not great either. That's a little bit too bare bones. So hopefully at the end of the day, this new item can increase just the sheer amount of offerings and combinations that can be made. Because look, like I said, when you offer a new item that's completely unique to the game, the amount of diversity that you create by default is huge. And the impacts that it can have on build diversity is, again, equally huge. So yeah, if this is what they're going with in the game, I think that could be really great and really beneficial and offer a new source of life to the game that we don't see. But yeah, guys, that'll be it for this video. Hopefully year 5 does not disappoint. Hopefully this new gear item that they're talking about does not disappoint. And hopefully the story, kind of supports why they're doing some of these things. And it would be a really great tie-in. It would be a really great way to kind of conceive all of this stuff that's going on. But thank you guys for watching. I'll see you in the next one.